Welcome back to Silicon Bites, and today a contentious topic, one, however, which is fully justified by an article that has just come out in Russia and been widely reported upon by several leading Russian publications. Before we jump into this contentious topic of civil war and its likelihood in Russia, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. Your support is immensely important. It helps to keep me going. It helps to keep this channel going and the material that we produce every day to try and highlight why it's so important to support Ukraine. And your support at this time is especially appreciated as we plan the remaining events for the rest of the year. We're looking at Kiev, Paris, and Copenhagen for some of our upcoming events. We can't do any of this without your support, and I'm exceedingly grateful for it. Now let's jump into the topic. Civil war is the Kremlin's number one fear, according to the Kremlin's own chief sociologist. If I was asked the question, I'd have said that this is a low probability, as is the fragmentation of Russia into myriad smaller states. It's something for which, of course, many people observing this war ardently hope for. It's something that many Ukrainians deeply wish for. But it's not impossible, but it is very unlikely, even after the conclusion of Putin's disastrous war in Ukraine. On this channel, we have speculated extensively that a palace coup is more likely, or a kind of oligarch civil war for a limited period and with limited scope is by far the more likely outcome than a full-blown civil war. But Alexander Kharichev has put in black and white what Moscow usually whispers behind closed doors. The number one threat, he says, to Russia is civil war. So, do they know something that we don't? Or is this classic paranoia from the minion of a tyrannical and geriatric dictator? Is this Kremlin syndrome that sees enemies and calamity around every corner? Well, let's explore this article and this fascinating question. This article by Kharichev asks, who are we? The Kremlin's early warning system seems to be going off loud and clear. Alexander Kharichev, the powerful head of the Presidential Directorate for Monitoring and Analysis of Social Processes, published an essay called Kto my? Who are we? In the journal Государство. In it, he lists 5 civilizational challenges facing Russia, and more specifically the Kremlin, and tops the list with civil war/internal split. Russian business daily Vedomosti reviewed the piece and confirmed the framing and the source. November 5th, 2025. State-aligned outlets amplified the messaging here. Gazeta.ru ran a straight write-up enumerating the threats and, crucially, Kharichev's remarkable, absurd even claim that Ukraine war averted a loss of sovereignty in Russia. This is one striking line from it. Для России СВО оказалось очищением. A translation of this means, for Russia, the special military operation proved to be a cleansing. That's from Gazeta.ru, November 5th. So how is this absurd conclusion possible? On the one hand, the war in Ukraine has brought Russia to the point of civilizational collapse, and in the same moment he claims that it saved the character of Russian civilization, purity through destruction, death, and isolation from the West. How delusional is this? Well, we need to unpack all 5 of his civilizational challenges to perhaps understand this better. Here are the 5 civilizational challenges for Russia that Kharichev lists. One is civil war/internal split, the social fragmentation and even division of the country, a loss of the ability to fight for Russia's preservation and development, гражданская война, as he puts it. Who does he envisage is fighting whom in this civil war? Well, it's likely in his framing that it is conservative nationalist forces against those that align with the liberal European left. But that is not the most likely conflict. Rather, I think the more likely conflict is a fight among the elite, between the elites, and it's not ideological, it's over resources. If Putin's grip on power visibly weakens, or the costs of his senseless war continue to increase to the point where he can't pay off oligarchs or the Siloviki class, then that will trigger a narrow and limited civil war amongst the elites, scrabbling for control, scrabbling for resources. Number two, he lists loss of sovereignty as important. That is military, territorial, political, and cultural. Well, this is the most grotesque idea of all five, that Russia preserves its so-called sovereignty by erasing Ukraine as a lesser or even non-existent sovereignty. This seems to be the logic of the regime. But in fact, Putin has made Russia dependent on China by embarking on this war in a way that it never was before. It is now something of a vassal state with a far lessened scope to exercise not only national sovereignty, but any kind of regime independence in foreign policy. Third, he lists depopulation as the next great threat to Russian civilization. But he frames this not in the way that perhaps we'd think of it. He frames it as a rejection of family and children, a broader crisis of family values. Well, demographics were a ticking time bomb before the war, and have only been exacerbated by its endless character, its extreme profligacy with life, the way it treats the Russian population as material to be expended without consideration of their inherent value or any kind of human rights at the whim of the Tsar in a totally barbaric fashion. So again, his framing of this is perverse, even though demographics is a real issue. Fourth, he lists loss of trust in the authorities and the breakdown of the political system. Again, the irony of his statement is seemingly lost on the author. The fact that the regime is having to resort to extreme repression tells you the real source of the loss of trust, the endless lies and spin and need to fabricate enemies to try to instill loyalty in the population is simply desperate. It shows extreme weakness. And the idea that this loyalty through coercion is the solution, of course, is really absurd. Yet again, the solution proposed by our Kremlin ideologues actually points the way towards the underlying problem. And then fifth and finally, he lists dehumanization. But rather than the dehumanization of the Putin regime, of its own population and its so-called enemies, he lists things like transhumanism, retreat into virtual worlds, and reducing the person to a mere consumer. Rather than the dehumanization of a brutish war and the extreme coercion tactics used to fill the ranks and compel people to fight, apparently the real enemy is Western liberal agenda. The plurality that comes from freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of association. These, he thinks, are the real threats to Russian civilization. Kharichev forecasts a federal law on patriotic education as part of his solution, with goals, tasks, and even KPIs for state bodies and schools. This was reported in Agents.media, November 5th. This marks a further descent into full-blown ideological framing from the early years education in Russia, right from sort of kindergarten and toddler age group. What we don't know is with what alacrity or not these directives of ideological education from the Kremlin are implemented on a local level and how they are met by students. Are people embracing this so-called ideological or patriotic education with a kind of nationalistic fervor, or do people on the ground greet it with indifference and contempt in the way that much of the Soviet propaganda and ideology was greeted in the latter decades of the Soviet Union? We just don't know. There simply is not the available research to assess the impact of patriotic education, especially in the regions and provinces that has gone into a high gear since the start of the special military operation. But this article really matters, not only because of the source, how senior he is in the Kremlin hierarchy, the fact that he's a senior and established Kremlin ideologue. They don't float this kind of stuff casually. And the fact that several publications thought it safe and serious enough to analyze and review the article in detail is important. Putting civil war at the top of the risk stack is a rare admission that a hyper-militarized, over-centralized, economically strained Russia could fracture. The Moscow Times confirms that Kharichev is considered a leading sociolog. They call him a главный sociolog Kremlin, warning of internal war, depopulation, breakdown of trust, and systemic collapse. Well, that's from the Russian version of the Moscow Times, November 5th. The problem is stark. The problem he lays out are real, but the article hints at solutions, though I assess that he is picking the wrong solutions every time to the problems that are put forth. Kharichev's diagnosis is apocalyptic, and his solution is to glue the country together with ideology. More Russian fascism, more aggression, greater exceptionalism, not less. Don't abandon our own, he says. Nasze nie бросаем. But we see, of course, in reality on the front, Russians are abandoned to their fate day in, day out, abandoned to end their lives in the most horrific way on the front lines. They're treated as material. Kharichev says that advocating for a cult of service instead of services and a managerial fantasy of patriotic KPIs. Well, this sounds incredibly hollow. It sounds so much like the kind of exhortations to service and duty towards the end of the Soviet Union when everything, in practical terms, was breaking down. So he sees the cracks, and rather than addressing the root causes, he is seeking to paper them over with more of the same, more war, more mobilization, more ideology. It's not only incoherent, but it is also a route, a solution that makes the feared collapse that he talks about more likely. Well, let's go into some of the pressures that are piling up on Putin's regime. The war economy is one, and it is widening the cracks that they're seeking to paper over with this hollow ideology. We have to follow the money here. And there we find some of the source of this fear. War spending is the core of the state budget now and a core of its priorities. Russia's 2025 budget set defense at 13.5 trillion rubles, about 32% of total spending. This is a post-Soviet high. That was reported in Reuters September 30th. 2024, and it's only got worse since then. Defense spending will account for 32% of total 2025 budget expenditure. Looking ahead, the 2026 draft keeps defense spending plus security near 38% of total outlays. That's according to Reuters, September 29th, 2025. This, of course, is the public line item in the budget, the figures they'll admit to, but under the counter spending, hidden spending on defense and the war is likely to be far, far higher. And add to this the sense of rising pressure, inflation and living costs. Utility prices and tariffs are rising faster than the official inflation expectations. The government's own planning implies steeper housing and utility hikes across 26 to 28 than previously forecast. Again, that's from Moscow Times, September 30th of this year. The regional electricity jump prices have already hit households hard. That is reported in Meduza on the same date. Record low unemployment and soaring wages signal a red-hot, capacity-constrained wartime economy, not broad prosperity, as the regime claims. Even Sberbank's German Gref called the economy overheated, with capacity utilization around 81%. That might sound good on paper. In reality, it is not a good sign of a healthy economy. Add to this Kiev's drone campaign and the stepped-up sanctions enforcement, which are biting, perhaps seriously, for the first time since the start of the war, when the Grey Fleet workaround started to take shape. Russia's seaborne refined oil product exports fell by 500,000 barrels per day from its 2025 highs to just 2 million barrels per day. That's a lot of capacity shaved out. It's the lowest figure in 5 years, and that's before The latest round of secondary sanctions is taken into account, and apparently the closing down of certain buying capacity in China and India, which may well impact those figures further. Bloomberg adds that crude flows are plunging as US measures tighten and barrels stack up on tankers in ports. That's from November 4th, 2025. There may come a point where Russia runs out of storage capacity for oil, or its exporting terminals such as Tuapse can no longer handle the flows, with serious implications for its oil extraction infrastructure. The solution may be to drop prices again, destroying margins. And that may make Russian oil again viable for sanctions busting to be profitable enough, too profitable to pass up on for some of its partners. Or else there is a disastrous alternative, closing wells, shuttering extraction infrastructure, but that may be very costly to restart that industry again. We also have to look at some of the breaking news this week. Drones, refineries, Pokrovsk, to see another source of the Kremlin's problems and the source of their paranoia, which of course they are not directly addressing in the proposed solutions. Back to the source of Russia's economic ills, the war in Ukraine and the Pokrovsk campaign, it is entirely illustrative of the problem, hugely costly and profligate with human life. 21 months to take a city that is being reduced to rubble, a place with no economic value after the battle has taken place, and which would cost an absolute fortune to rebuild, to turn it back into a viable urban and economic space. Russian forces keep pressing on around Pokrovsk, seeking their biggest territorial gain in nearly 2 years. The Independent described the months-long urban grind and incremental Russian moves. That's November 6th. Meanwhile, ISW's November 5th assessment flagged continued mobilization creep and battlefield adaptation, especially in how they're taking Pokrovsk, using infiltration forces block by block. It may have some strategic value as a logistics hub, i.e. a stepping stone from one pile of rubble to the next, but the whole campaign, when you zoom out, has no real economic logic behind it. Rather, it is political optics that are main driver and concern for the Kremlin, having a victory to brag about, to flaunt, and use as leverage with Trump and others. It is a completely hollow exercise in brutality and signaling. It does not have a sound military justification. And while Putin pursues trophy victories and in parallel criminal attacks on civilian centers in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are following a much more strategic course of action, using their scarce yet effective resources to undermine the foundations of Putin's war economy, his oil extraction and transportation, and now the broader energy infrastructure. Volgograd is on fire. On November 6th, Russia said at least 75 Ukrainian drones had hit targets nationwide, sparking a lethal blaze in Volgograd's industrial area and halting dozens of flights. That's reported by Reuters yesterday. Another cycle of refinery strikes followed, with additional reporting noting hits on major plant in the region. That's reporting from The Independent and Reuters. All this is taking a major toll on the revenues that the Putin regime depends on to power its war machine. Let's turn also to one of the other gaping wounds, self-inflicted wounds of Russian society, which is not addressed in the article we went through, or the 5 civilizational challenges, but I think is one of the major challenges to the Russian system. That is the Kursk scandal and corruption. And this is another reason why the exhortation to focus on ideology won't fix the major issue that is plaguing the Putin regime, which is systemic rather than a cosmetic feature. It is corruption. If you need a parable for state dysfunction, feeding social or even elite anger, then the story of Kursk exactly provides that. So fortifications, funds and arrests. Ex-Kursk governor Alexei Smirnov, who held the job for much of 2024, was detained in April 25 over alleged embezzlement tied to border defences and the construction of them, or, as it turned out, the non-construction of them. He later acknowledged guilt in court proceedings, as per state media announcements, Re-reported by Reuters in September, October this year, his predecessor met a grim end game. Roman Starovoyt, elevated to transport minister, was abruptly fired and found dead hours later. Investigators pointed to a self-inflicted death, but many doubt that this is what really happened. Well, that was around July 7th, 8th of this year. And another strand feeding the paranoia of the Kremlin is the lingering memory of mutiny. Wagner has already set a precedent for how these things may play out. We've seen how the state reacts to existential danger before. After the June 2023 Wagner mutiny, Putin told security services, in fact, you have stopped a civil war. That was reported by Reuters June 27th, 2023. But the reality was far more interesting. The all-powerful Silviki and army stayed in their offices and barracks and sat the crisis out to see who'd come out on top. Scared, of course, to fall foul of Putin, but also deterred from challenging Prigozhin in case he came out on top and emerged from the fight as the next Tsar. This was no civil war scenario, but it raised the spectre of a palace coup of historic proportions. The state intelligence and security apparatus was not simply incompetent, but paralyzed. This must have terrified the Tsar Putin. So what do the numbers say about the strain on Putin's regime and their desperate search for ideology to try to glue things together? Well, one more frame for Kharichev's civil war fear, and which plays into the demographic fears as well, is casualties. By late July 2025, British military intelligence estimated over 1 million Russian soldiers killed or wounded since 2022. That's reported in Reuters in July of this year. No matter the exact figure, the order of magnitude is society shaking. Each loss drains resource from the economy and reduces populations in the provinces and fringes of the Russian Empire. This can only accelerate the process of population decline outside the main urban centers. A militarized economy, society, and coercive ideological education do nothing to fix the problem or plug the population gap. In fact, it probably accelerates it. So what the Kremlin prescribes is not what the country needs. Kharichev prescribes ideology, patriotic KPIs, and a new service, not services ethos, and a mythic family of families. But ideology doesn't fix the corruption. It doesn't address the nepotism, the procurement graft, the destruction of Russia's industrial base, its refineries and oil infrastructure. It doesn't address the tightening sanctions, the labor gaps, and the falling real incomes. The state can command loyalty, but it can't centrally plan public trust. Independent Russian commentators have been mapping this divergence for months. One argued that the war has blown up the pre-2022 regime model, exposing institutional paralysis, elite fragmentation, and social fracture. Another warned that the regime is creating armed, traumatized constituencies who won't easily mobilize. This is a classic ingredient for internal conflict if a succession crisis or battlefield shock hits the regime. This again exposes the lie about the war cleansing Russia. In fact, it's created a huge problem of traumatized, criminalized, and in some cases radicalized soldiers, which would be a major problem for the regime if hundreds of thousands of them returned all at once to a shattered and hopeless rural economy. Well, what to watch out for next in this story of Russia's potential regime collapse and fragmentation? Well, one is refineries. It's about economic resilience or lack of it. Does Russia keep product exports going near the 2 million barrels per day, or do strikes and sanctions drag that lower and lower? This is a critical point for regime survival. That's according to Reuters and Bloomberg. Two is the budget triage. Where do cuts land to sustain a 38 to 41% spend on security state and military spending, especially on the war, and now especially that the military-industrial complex, the initial Keynesian boom that drove economic growth, seems to be over. 3 is the patriotic education law. Does a KPI-driven ideological bill appear? And how coercive are its enforcement teeth? Is the implementation superficial or backed by extreme coercive pressure and rolled out at scale? Can the Kremlin paper over the cracks in its decision-making, its governance, with ideology and enforced patriotism? 4, the Pokrovsk axis. We covered this in an episode the other day, but Pokrovsk is a critical inflection point in the war. Does Russia achieve a politically driven map change? And does it have any power of leverage if it wins that victory in deterring Ukraine's allies from providing more military support? Or do losses outpace any gains, as we've seen in many other campaigns before this? Well, this is a question addressed by ISW and The Independent. And finally, corruption. Point 5, Kursk, justice and injustice. Are we to see prosecutions systemic? Are we going to see local officials used as scapegoats rather than the core problem of corruption being addressed? We should watch Smirnov's case and various regional purges that are playing out. This may be the first sign not of addressing the core issues of corruption and nepotism, but of the regime consuming its own minions and loyalists, using corruption as a targeted tool to repress the so-called elites. Not a broad civil war, but a kind of self-consuming struggle within the elite, a palace war of those oligarchs and administrative hierarchies. Well, that is a topic addressed by Gazeta.ru, RBC and Reuters. So what is the main takeaway from this episode? The Kremlin now says the quiet part out loud. Radical fragmentation of Russia is a threat. Civil war is a distinct possibility, at least in terms of the regime's list of priorities. Is it paranoia? Perhaps. Is it impossible? Certainly not. But unless Moscow addresses the war economy's structural damage and has the self-awareness to see the war as an outcome of a brittle and weak state, not a strong one, then ideology will just be a sticking plaster on the gaping cracks. What Russia needs is a succession strategy and an end to militarism and the obsession with empire and control. But the regime's proposed solution is just the opposite. More war, more militarization of the economy, more imperial indoctrination via education and the media, and the absolute avoidance of a succession process, a planned transition to the next Tsar. That is the opposite to what Putin is trying to do. So these problems are likely to be compounded and accelerate the fragmentation of Russia while they carry on believing their own hype that a fascistic, nationalistic, barely coherent ideology can tape together the gaping wound in the structure and governance of Russia. Collapse may be on the cards, and an elite war over the remaining spoils when Putin's pyramid of power does finally implode.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!